And I mean, when it comes down to the nitty-gritties of what a binational democratic state could look like by way of actual policy considerations, I mean, how do we even begin to envision one? Because I think, as we've been discussing so far, just the sheer extent to which the idea of Jewish supremacy is hardwired into the prevailing Israeli consciousness, it's hard to imagine that. Obviously, we hope for some period of political mobilization and a movement for equality, which makes this argument and transforms minds and perspectives. But it seems so bound up into the Israeli story, the Zionist story, that there must be a safe haven
Yes.
that is protective of Jewish identity, expression, and culture, and that interprets anything outside of that idea as existentially threatening. There is a dimension to this that is very difficult to undo, and the idea of sharing and distributing power, rights, and freedoms in an equal state is very hard for a lot of people to conceive, even when I've made the argument. So, by way of description, what does that look like?
Yes, I mean, you're right. It's a very, very powerful story, but I think it's also important to remember that stories can change. There was not always a Zionist consensus among Jews around the world, not at all. And the irony of American Jews or Australian or South African or British Jews saying that Jews can only be safe when there is an ethno-nationalist Jewish supremacist state is that those diaspora Jews are ourselves betting our own family safety on the idea of equality under the law, right? I mean, the reason that we feel safe in America is in large measure because we believe that America has certain constitutional protections. Of course, we benefit from them more than others, perhaps because most American Jews are considered white. But that's the bet that we've made. And if you look at Jewish immigration patterns, actually, most Jews from the Soviet Union didn't want to go to Israel-Palestine. They wanted to go to America, right? And so this is there is another Jewish story, another way of interpreting the history of anti-Semitism, which doesn't lead to the answer that Jews need their own ethno-national supremacist state, but that in fact Jews need to fight for equality under the law and liberal democracy everywhere because that's good for us as well as for other people. And that was a large part of the motivation for Jewish participation in the civil rights movement in the United States. Jews thought, well, if Black people fail in their desire for civil rights, that will mean that America is a kind of country where we as a small, conspicuous religious minority won't fare very well. But if the civil rights movement succeeds, we will actually benefit, as Jews have benefited massively from the success of that movement. So there's a different story that I think can be told. And it's important, I think, to acknowledge that, yes, Jewish trauma maybe does incline some Jews to think in terms of existential threats. But as I don't need to tell you, it's also the case that any group of people, including white South Africans and white Southerners in the United States and Protestants in Northern Ireland, any group, I think, almost any group that benefits from supremacy tends to see equality as an existential threat. You even see this in the United States among many white Americans today. See, the idea of a genuinely multiracial liberal democracy in America is considered the equivalent of white genocide, right? And so Jews are not unique in this. In some ways, we're doing the same kind of move that so many other groups that benefit from oppression have done. And so it's really important to de-exceptionalize Israel-Palestine and look at the history of how those other groups were able, at least some people of them were able to unlearn that, not because they woke up one day and just decided to, but because they came under pressure that made the status quo unsustainable, and that forced them to think and be open to hearing a different kind of vision. And I think that if that's true for Protestants in Northern Ireland, it's true for white South Africans to some degree, it's true for white Southerners in the United States to some degree, then, I mean, the story never ends, obviously. I don't need to tell you in South Africa. It's not like the story for equality ends even after the day you have a free election. It continues, but that you can make progress, and other groups have done so, and that we could as well.
I'm glad you brought up white South Africans and the South African story, because you have South African roots.
Right.
And I'm curious about those roots and the extent to which, if at all, that might have played a formative role in your political consciousness, and being able to draw those comparisons. Of course, it's now largely, there's a widely building consensus that Israel is an apartheid state. That, of course, derives from the South African experience. And I'm wondering if that was and has been informative to you in coming to the conclusions that you have.
Yes, it had a very big impact on me. And I think that one of the things that being the child of white South Africans gave me, which is perhaps different than a lot of other American Jews, is that for a lot of American Jews, when they think about their families or the story of their families, they think about it largely as a story of being oppressed, of being victimized through anti-Semitism, and then kind of overcoming that. But when I think about my family story, I do think about the experience of anti-Semitism in Lithuania and in Egypt for my grandmother and other places. But I also think about the fact that my family were white South Africans who benefited immensely from a system of oppression. And I remember so vividly when I was younger how people justified that, and these were people I loved, but people would justify it by saying all kinds of things that, if you were in that little bubble, had a kind of seemed plausible, look at what happened in the rest of Africa. Look at those countries have made a mess of it, or Black South Africans are not ready for government, or all these things that now or the Zulus and the Xhosas will never get along together. All these kind of things that at the time, again, if you were just in a little white South African bubble, might have made sense to you. But now, with the perspective of history, we can see that they were racist and ignorant statements. And they were based on a deep ignorance, and I hear so many echoes of that kind of language when I hear Jews, not all Jews, of course, but many Jews talk about Palestinians, and this kind of set of claims about what Palestinians are like, or the way they behave, or what would happen if they were able to gain some degree of political power. And it reminds me so much of that, and I feel that same sense of of confusion or sense of like trying to reconcile the fact that these are evil arguments with the fact that I know these are good people, or at least that I know in many aspects of their life they are deeply good people, and in many aspects of their life they're even brilliant people. I mean, one of the things that astonishes me so often about Jewish discourse about Israel-Palestine, Palestinians, is that people who have deep, brilliant insights and sophisticated ways of thinking about so many things, when they come to this topic, they lose all of that intellectual curiosity. And you ask them, like, well, how many books have you read by Palestinians? How much have you tried to actually understand Palestinian history, Palestinian literature, Palestinian film, like Palestinian politics? And the answer is generally very, very little. And I think, but how does this make sense for someone who I know is deeply learned on these other subjects? So there is a way, I think, in which oppression and being the beneficiary of oppression kind of makes you stupid. Even if you're not stupid about lots of other things, it makes you stupid about that. And I see that same dynamic play itself out. And so it brings back for me often memories of the time that I spent in apartheid South Africa and the conversations I had during that time.